Among London's mansions and Manchester row houses, 1.5 million Victorian servants, mostly women, worked 16-hour days, earning less in a year than their employers spent on a single dinner party. Some risked everything to survive, like Mary Phillips, a young maid who stole spoons worth less than her unpaid wages and was sentenced to years of hard labor. Why did so many choose theft over starvation? And why did the system punish them so brutally while protecting the wealthy? The answers reveal a hidden history the Victorian elite tried to bury. By the late 19th century, domestic service had become the backbone of Victorian Britain's social order. The 1891 census counted 1.5 million servants across the country, with women making up over 90% of the workforce. These women formed the largest occupational group in Britain, yet their lives were defined by relentless labor and dependence. 16-hour days were standard, stretching from dawn until late at night, 6 or even 7 days a week. For many, there was no such thing as a day off. Wages for this endless work were meager. A housemaid could expect just £12 to £20 a year, barely enough to survive, while the butler, the highest-ranking male servant, might earn £50 to £80. Pay was not only low, but uncertain. Employers often docked wages for the smallest mistakes, from a broken teacup to a scuffed shoe. A single misstep could mean weeks of lost income, with no legal right to challenge deductions or demand fair treatment. Servants lived where they worked, packed into freezing attic rooms or damp basement quarters. Privacy did not exist. Beds were squeezed between trunks and water pipes, sometimes shared with siblings or strangers. The air was thick with coal dust and the smell of kitchen scraps. Servants' meals were leftovers from upstairs, cold potatoes and bread crusts after the household had finished feasting. Every aspect of a servant's life depended on the goodwill of their employer. The most powerful tool was the character reference. Without it, no other household would hire them. Dismissal without a character meant instant unemployment and, often, a straight path to the workhouse. There were no contracts, no minimum wage laws, and no protections against abuse. Servants could be dismissed at a moment's notice, wages withheld for any reason, and complaints ignored. Yet each day, these women moved through rooms lined with velvet drapes and silver candelabras, mending silk gowns they would never wear, polishing silver they could never own. They watched food thrown away by the pound while they themselves went hungry. The contrast between their own poverty and the luxury surrounding them was impossible to ignore. For many, the boundary between right and wrong blurred in the shadow of such inequality. The servant class was not just a workforce. It was a system built to keep the poor in their place, while the wealthy lived untouched by the hardship beneath their own roofs. Mary Phillips was just 19 when she entered service in a Manchester household in 1876. Her days began before sunrise and ended long after dark, but her wages, £12 a year, were always in question. By midsummer, her employer owed her 3 months' pay, a debt of £3. With no family to fall back on and eviction looming, Mary's situation grew desperate. She watched her employer's table set with silver, while her own meals came from scraps and cold bread. Each night, she counted the coins she did not have, knowing that without her wages, she would be turned out into the street. One evening, Mary slipped 2 silver spoons from the kitchen drawer. Their value, £2, was less than what she was owed, but enough to pay the rent and buy food. She wrapped the spoons in her apron and walked to the nearest pawn shop, hoping for a few quiet weeks to save herself. Instead, the pawnbroker recognized the household crest and called the police. Within days, Mary stood before the magistrate at the Manchester Quarter Sessions, accused of theft. Her employer, present in court, faced no questions about the unpaid wages. The court made no allowance for her story. The judge called it a clear case of larceny, and Mary was sentenced to 2 years hard labor at Strangeways Prison. The sentence was severe, but not unusual for a servant. In the eyes of the law, the value of the spoons mattered more than the wages withheld or the hunger that had driven her. Mary's name was entered into the prison register, her hair cut short, her belongings taken. She spent her days breaking stones and picking oakum, her nights in a cold cell. Letters home, if she had anyone to write to, went unanswered. When her sentence ended, Mary was released with nothing but a criminal record. No household would hire a thief, and without work, she drifted to the workhouse. She died there at 24, her life reduced to a few lines in the parish ledger. Mary Phillips' crime was one of necessity, but the system left no room for mercy. Her story, found in court files and death records, is a stark reminder of what it meant to be both poor and powerless in Victorian Britain. Every day, the gulf between the world of the servants and the world they served played out in small, grinding humiliations. After hours spent polishing silver and setting elaborate tables, maids waited for their turn at the kitchen scraps. Cold potatoes, bread crusts, and the bits of meat that had not been tossed into the bin. In many households, ledgers recorded pounds of uneaten food thrown away each week, while servants grew thin on leftovers. The same hands that mended torn silk gowns and pressed velvet curtains were forbidden to wear anything but plain cotton uniforms paid for out of their own wages. If a uniform tore or stained, the cost of repair came out of the maid's pay, not the employer's purse. Wages were always at risk. A dropped plate or a chipped teacup could mean a week's deduction, written in neat ink in the wage book. Servants might spend months working off the price of a broken vase while their employers replaced it without a thought. Even the smallest mistake, a scuffed shoe or a missed button, could cost a day's pay. For some, the entire month's wage vanished for offences as minor as speaking out of turn. The pressure was constant and inescapable. Servants lived under the threat of instant dismissal, with no hope of recovering lost wages or defending themselves against accusations. Surrounded by luxury, yet denied even the basics, many began to see theft not as a crime, but as a desperate balance. Taking a loaf of bread or a discarded piece of clothing felt like survival, not betrayal. The daily injustices blurred the lines between right and wrong, leaving thousands to weigh hunger against the risk of being caught. In the shadow of wealth, the moral calculus of the servant was shaped by deprivation and the quiet knowledge that the law would never be on their side. In 1889, a London courtroom became the stage for a debate that would redefine the boundaries of theft for Victorian servants. Lizzie M., a lady's maid, stood accused of taking a dress her mistress had discarded for charity. The dress, once destined for the poor, now hung from Lizzie's shoulders as she walked through a public market. Her former employer spotted her and summoned the police, insisting the dress still belonged to the household. The case drew attention in newspapers across the city. At its heart was a simple question: when does something truly stop belonging to the wealthy and become fair game for those who serve them? Lizzie's defense argued that her mistress had already cast the dress aside, making it no different than rubbish left at the curb. The prosecutor countered that, in a household, nothing was ever truly abandoned unless the employer gave it directly to the servant. The judge agreed with the employer, and in his ruling, he declared that all household items, no matter how worn or unwanted, remained the legal property of the master or mistress unless explicitly gifted. Lizzie's assumption, he said, amounted to theft. The verdict was swift. Lizzie received 6 months of hard labor. The sentence was not about the monetary value of the dress, but about daring to claim a right to anything from the world she was employed to sustain. This decision set a precedent. From that moment, even cast-off clothing or scraps set aside for charity could not be touched by servants without permission. The law closed one of the few grey areas where survival and dignity might overlap. For Lizzie, and for thousands like her, the smallest act of appropriation now carried the weight of criminal intent. Court ledgers from the late 19th century record a pattern impossible to ignore. The average amount stolen by a servant was just £5, often the value of a few silver spoons or a bundle of cast-off clothes. Yet the punishment was severe, with an average sentence of 18 months of hard labor for crimes that rarely exceeded the cost of a single dinner party. Sentencing records show little distinction between survival theft and premeditated burglary. The law treated all servant offenders as threats to the very foundation of property, regardless of motive or circumstance. Behind these harsh sentences lay a legal framework designed to protect wealth, not labor. Domestic workers had no written contracts, no right to appeal wage deductions, and no avenue for redress if dismissed without pay. Employers could withhold months of wages on a whim, leaving servants penniless and powerless. The courts recognized only the employer's loss, never the servant's deprivation. Even when evidence showed wages unpaid or food destroyed rather than shared, the law insisted all household goods belonged to the master until explicitly given away. it would take until 1909 for Parliament to pass the Trade Boards Act, Britain's first minimum wage law. Before then, domestic servants remained outside every legal protection. Dismissal meant instant eviction, and for many the start of a criminal record that would follow them for life. The legal system did not just punish theft, it institutionalized the conditions that made theft inevitable. In the ledgers of Victorian justice, the value of property outweighed the value of a servant's life, and the machinery of the courts ground on, indifferent to the suffering it produced. Catherine, the cook, and Emma, the parlour-maid, worked side by side in an Edinburgh estate where abundance and waste went hand in hand. Over 2 years, they watched baskets of bread, joints of meat, and bottles of wine being carted to the rubbish heap, while they and the rest of the staff picked over leftovers and counted every penny. Their employers' ledgers recorded food destroyed each week, enough to feed a dozen families. For Catherine and Emma, the boundary between waste and want became a line they were willing to cross. Their plot was methodical, not impulsive. Hidden deep in the servant quarters, they built a cache worth £150, a fortune compared to a maid's yearly wage. The cache grew slowly, a bottle of claret here, a bundle of linens there, the odd silver candlestick tucked away after a grand dinner. Each item was carefully noted in a ledger, written in Emma's steady hand. The account book became their blueprint for escape, listing every purloined item, its value, and a running total. Their plan was clear. Once the hoard was large enough, they would leave service and open a boarding house, using the goods as their starting capital. For 2 years, no one suspected a thing. The household carried on, discarding what could not be consumed, while Catherine and Emma's ledger filled with careful entries. Then, in January 1885, a strange odor in the servants' corridor led the butler to investigate. Behind a false panel, he discovered the hidden cache: wine, preserved foods, linens, and silver, all meticulously accounted for. The police were called, and the evidence was laid out in court: the cache, the ledger, and the plan for a new life far from service. At Edinburgh Sheriff Court, both women stood trial not just for theft, but for conspiracy. The account books left no doubt. This was a deliberate, organized effort, not a moment of desperation. The judge handed down 5 years of penal servitude for each. Their story, preserved in police inventories and court records, stands apart from the quick thefts of hunger or need. Catherine and Emma's plot was a calculated answer to a system that offered no hope of advancement, only endless labor and the constant threat of dismissal. Their ledger, and the punishment that followed, illustrates how organized resistance grew out of relentless inequality. The discovery, the trial, and the sentence reveal a legal system more intent on protecting property than addressing the conditions that produced the theft. Catherine and Emma planned a future. The court closed that future, and their fate became a record of the limits placed on women in domestic service. Release from prison rarely meant freedom for Victorian servant women. The mark of a criminal record followed them everywhere, stamped in ledgers and whispered in kitchens. No reputable household would risk hiring a thief, no matter how small the crime or how desperate the motive. For most, The search for work ended at the doors of the workhouse, where the only certainty was hunger and shame. Prison registers and poor relief files reveal the bleak pattern. More than half of women convicted of servant theft found themselves back before the courts within 2 years. The recidivism rate hovered around 60%, not from hardened criminality, but because the outside world offered no way back. With their names blackened, former servants drifted into the shadows of Victorian society. Some turned to prostitution, the last resort for women barred from honest employment. Others, facing rejection from family and community, chose suicide over starvation. The physical cost of hard labor left its own scars. Months spent picking oakum or grinding at the treadwheel broke bodies as well as spirits. Medical records from Strangeways Prison and Holloway Prison describe women released with chronic respiratory problems, damaged joints, and failing eyesight. Many were no longer fit for any work at all. In parish infirmaries, former maids in their 20s and 30s died of illnesses more common to the aged: tuberculosis, heart failure, and malnutrition, traced directly to prison hardships. Social surveys from the 1880s and 1890s catalogue the fate of these women with chilling regularity. The path ran from dismissal to theft to prison to the workhouse, and finally to an unmarked grave. Families often disowned daughters with convictions, fearing the stain would spread to younger siblings seeking work. For those who survived, life narrowed to the barest means of survival: shelter in a common ward, meals of thin gruel, and the knowledge that escape was almost impossible. The story of the Victorian servant thief does not end in the courtroom. It lingers in the records of the poorhouse, the prison infirmary, and the city morgue. The punishment for stealing a few pounds worth of goods was not just time served, but a lifetime erased from respectable society, with little hope of return. Today, over 67 million domestic workers worldwide still lack basic labor protections. The Victorian system's legacy endures wherever poverty meets unchecked power behind closed doors. When survival is criminalized, justice becomes a privilege, not a right. The fight for fair wages and dignity continues, reminding us that the measure of a society is how it treats those who serve. What does that measure reveal about us now?